Just to give you a little brief bio on myself, I am an instructor of history at Wayne County Community College District over in Detroit. I've been there now 19 years. I teach African-American history, U.S. history, and world history. And prior to that, I taught high school social studies in the Washington, D.C. area. I went to Hampton University undergrad, a historically Black college. That was the alma mater of Booker T. Washington, where I got my bachelor's degree in history. And then also I have a Master of Arts and Teaching degree from Howard University, which is the alma mater of our Vice President, Kamala Harris. And also I have a Master's in Public Relations from Michigan State University. I'm a native Detroiter, born and raised in Northwest Detroit, went to Jay-Z Elementary and Cass Technical High School, which is where Diana Ross and many famous Detroiters have graduated from. So without further ado, I will now go into our presentation on Juneteenth, the history and aftermath of the African-American community in the United States. The genesis of Juneteenth. So all of you should have learned in your U.S. history classes that on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed to free the slaves, and this was signed by President Abraham Lincoln. What is unbeknownst to the slaves in Texas and Louisiana is that they did not realize they were free until almost 2 years later. So what you see here on the left in the picture is General Order Number 3, which was carried by Major General Gordon Granger, a Union Army officer. So this was read to the slaves in Texas and Louisiana on this date in 1865 to say that they were free of servitude. So this day started out as Jubilee Day by former slaves in Galveston, Texas, which is right on the Gulf Coast. This was used as a springboard for getting out the vote rallies, which would be applicable to Reconstruction, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. African-American leaders raised $1,000, which was a lot of money for back then, for land in Houston to create Emancipation Park. This is the oldest park in the city of Houston, as well as the oldest park in the state of Texas. In 1898, the town of Limestone, Texas, saw 30,000 people come to celebrate Juneteenth. Now we delve into the aftermath of Juneteenth. Reconstruction was a vast labor movement of ignorant, muddled, and bewildered white men who had been disinherited of land and labor and fought a long battle with sheer subsistence, hanging on the edge of poverty, eating clay and chasing slaves, and now lurching up to manhood. This was said by the famous African-American civil rights leader and educator, Dr. W.B. Du Bois. Why was Reconstruction necessary? With the demise of legal servitude or slavery, the U.S. government wanted to incorporate the African-American population into mainstream society. New constitutional amendments were brought in to protect African Americans. You had the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery altogether, the 14th Amendment, which dealt with equal protection, due process under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans for the first time suffrage or the right to vote. It sought to unite all regions of North America politically, socially, and economically. Hold on here, I apologize. Okay. Education. This was the most significant accomplishment from Reconstruction and basically the major cornerstone for its being successful. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up as a government's operation to facilitate the creation of higher education institutions for African Americans, known as HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities. This is a picture of my first graduate school alma mater, Howard University in Washington, D.C. This is the Founders Library, the main library on campus. And I just want to let you know, you see there with the clock tower, they have stacks of books going all the way to the top. I remember I got in the elevator one time. It's one of those elevators with the screens, and I went all the way up almost to the top of the clock tower there. So it's a huge library. And also they have the Spin Garden collection, which is an archive of African American history. But HBCUs did not start in the South. They actually started before Reconstruction, 1853, at 2 in the north. If you drive down I-75, 3 hours to the south of here, you will find Wilberforce University, which was started by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, to which I am a member of. They started that university there. And then over outside of Philadelphia, they started Lincoln University, which was started by the African American Baptist Church. From Reconstruction up until the 1930s, you saw a lot of land grant HBCUs created in the American South. And there is one, actually, I would be remiss, I forgot to mention, right across from Wilberforce is Central State University. If you have watched Fox 2 News, if you remember Hugh Perkins, he was a graduate of Central State, as well as Dinah Lewis. They used to be on Channel 7. So they are both local alumni in the metropolitan Detroit area. By 1870, 4,000 schools at the K-12 level were staffed by 9,000 teachers, most of whom were African-American. By 1876, whites and African-Americans in the South were matriculating at segregated public schools. Organizations like the American Missionary Association, which was founded by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the founder of my undergraduate alma mater, Hampton University, worked in concert with the Freedmen's Bureau to establish schools. Some famous graduates of my undergraduate alma mater are Rick Mahorn, used to play for the Pistons, okay, Wanda Sykes, Booker T. Washington, okay, he was one of the early graduates of Hampton, class of 1876. Now we delve into politics. So we established the premise that the 15th Amendment was instituted to allow for African Americans to engage in suffrage with all elections, national, state, and local. Blanche K. Bruce and Hiram Revels were U.S. senators elected from Mississippi. So they were the two African-American U.S. senators at that time. P.B.S. Pinchback was the first African-American governor of Louisiana. He was not elected. The governor died, so he ascended to the occasion as governor. We will not see another African-American governor elected until 1989 with L. Douglas Wilder, who was elected governor of Virginia. Unfortunately, he was term limited. He served one term. There would not be another African-American governor until David Patterson, who was the lieutenant governor in New York when Eliot Spitzer resigned. Then he became governor, but he decided not to run for a full term. Then in 2012, Duval Patrick was the last African-American governor elected in the United States. Currently in 2023, we have no African-American governors. We've had African-Americans run for governor in Georgia and several, oh, I'm sorry, I stand corrected. We do have an African-American governor that was elected last year in Maryland, Wes Moore. Okay, so we do have an African-American governor. I'm sorry, this just happens so quickly. That's the thing about history. I mean, things happen, so quickly. So my family in Maryland would be angry at me if I didn't mention this. So there were 6 African-Americans who were in the U.S. House of Representatives during Reconstruction. They're all Republicans. You might ask, well, why were they all Republicans? As we had alluded to earlier, Abraham Lincoln was a member of the Republican Party, and they believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the Republicans from this period of time up until 1980, when Reagan came in, were for DEI or civil rights. The Democrats in the South were for segregation. So here are the 6 African-American House of Representative members. You had Benjamin Turner from Alabama, Robert DeLarge from South Carolina, Josiah Walls from Florida, Jefferson Long from Georgia, Joseph Rainey from South Carolina, and Robert Elliott from South Carolina. Notice that there are 3 African-American representatives from South Carolina. It's because South Carolina had one of the largest populations, or probably the largest population of African-Americans in the United States. You also had a lot of African-Americans in that state who were in the state and local offices, which segues to the next point, that African-Americans served on all levels, and they were even county clerks. The Freedmen's Bank and financial stability. Reverend John W. Alford, an abolitionist, and also A.M. Sperry, launched the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company to eliminate individual bank mismanagement and bring all African-American accounts under the auspices of a central institution. It was incorporated on March the 3rd, 1865, through an act of the United States Congress. It was headquartered in Washington, D.C., and 37 branches were in 17 states. A 7% interest was allowed for deposits. Unclaimed accounts were pooled into charitable funds that are used as an act of benevolence to African-American school children. So today we vote on millages for schools, but back then, whites did not feel that African-Americans should have support for the public schools. So that's why there was a special provision made with the Freedmen's Bank to finance public schools for African-Americans in the South. By 1870, African-Americans were the majority managing the operations of local branches. In 1874, Frederick Douglass tried to resurrect the bank from mismanagement issues. This is the year after the Panic of 1873, so this was the first economic depression in the United States. Douglass even donated his own personal monies to keep the institution from collapsing. When the bank closed, $2.9 million was owed to 61,144 depositors. This is a picture of where the bank once stood, about a couple blocks from the White House in Washington, D.C. Agriculture land ownership. General William Tecumseh Sherman granted an allotment of 40 acres and a mule to African Americans. This was land seized from the Confederates. Most likely, these were the plantations where the slaves were once in servitude. Special Field Order number 15 bestowed African Americans land on the Sea Islands of Georgia and on the islands off the coast of South Carolina. The African Americans who live in this quadrant of the South are known as Gullahs. They trace their ancestry back to West Africa. They're kind of like the Quakers. They live very humble lives. They don't have electricity, and they have faced actually a lot of encroachment recently, because if you've been to Hilton Head and some of the major resorts in Georgia and South Carolina, they want to take their land. And the way that they're doing this is, you've heard of the term eminent domain. Well, they're doing that and also raising the taxes. Years ago, there was a documentary about this on TV, as well as a story on 60 Minutes. If you've been to Hilton Head wasn't accessible by car until the 1950s. And once they built that bridge, then the African-American land ownership started to dwindle. Sharecropping was seen as a system which African-Americans would rent the land and maintain small plots and give a small portion to the owners of land by the end of the year. Also, there were 30,000 African-Americans owned land in the South. The confluence of the South's agricultural system by the federal government proved to be a disaster. Many African-Americans were forced into poverty because of sharecropping and were exploited by the white landowners. As to be expected, there was antagonism to Reconstruction. Southern Democrats were vehemently opposed to the federal government providing aid to African-Americans. Paramilitary organizations like the White League and the Ku Klux Klan were created to incite violence towards African-Americans, especially those who were elected officials. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, Tom Hanks' character was named for one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan, General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He and several other of his friends founded the Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee, right outside of Memphis in 1865. As a matter of fact, the Klan had a very big presence here in Michigan, right up 23 in Howell. The Grand Dragon of the Michigan Klan lived up there up until his death. I think he died in the 1990s. And his robe is now laying in state at a Museum of Tolerance. I believe it's at Grand Valley or Ferris State, one of those universities in the western part of Michigan, just outside of Grand Rapids. So whites from the North who assisted in Reconstruction were seen as carpetbaggers because they set up residence in the South to oversee the success of this initiative. The Enforcement Act, also known as the Civil Rights Act of 1870, was passed to provide protection for African Americans in dealing with white domestic terrorist organizations and to reduce the violence. The demise of Reconstruction. I mentioned earlier about the economic depression, 1873, so that changed the attitude of the Northerners. They saw African Americans as being non-factors in the South, so they're more focused on their own self-interests, economically and politically. By 1880, the Democrats had taken control of the South and state legislatures. The United States versus Cruikshank stated that only states could prosecute individuals under the KKK Act of 1871. Although Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican president, the Southern Democratic majority decimated the progress that was made by his predecessor, Ulysses S. Grant, under Reconstruction. Poll taxes, grandfather clauses, other intimidating taxes were used to disenfranchise African Americans from voting in the southern states. So poll taxes were that African Americans had to pay $3 to $5 to vote if they own land. The grandfather clause, they have to trace their ancestry back to their grandparents not being slaves in order to vote. And other intimidating tactics that were used. If they were illiterate, they tried to make them intentionally read the state constitution, knowing good and well they couldn't read. And if you saw the movie Selma, in the opening, Oprah Winfrey's character goes to a county clerk's office and they tried to quiz her on the locally elected officials, and she couldn't remember the names, so they stamped denied on her application. The inception of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a minstrel character. White actors during the genesis of vaudeville would put cork or shoe polish on their face and debase and ridicule African Americans in the theater. They would travel around the country. They would, make their lips big and just totally demean African Americans. And we still see some of that go on today. So Jim Crow was the moniker attached to the American apartheid system. In 1896, you had a case in the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson, created a separate but equal doctrine for public accommodations and transportation in the United States. Homer Plessy was a Creole. He was mixed with French and African ancestry. He was sitting in a railroad car in Louisiana, and whites felt that he had no business sitting in their space. So this led to the Jim Crow system. Education would be segregated 3 years later with the Supreme Court case Cumming versus Richmond County Board of Education. It ruled that taxpayers supporting public schools were for whites only, and it was legal. The South had de jure legal segregation. The North had de facto illegal segregation. Richmond, California, which is located in the San Francisco Bay Area, grew exponentially in population during World War II and the years prior to. Oil refineries, shipbuilding, and the Ford Motor Company were economic stimulus to the town's revenue. While social activities were integrated, housing was segregated. The federal government financed white residents to abandon temporary housing or apartments for the Rollingwood community, newly constructed homes. Within 2 decades, Richmond had become predominantly African American. After the war, the industrial base of Richmond would decline. When African Americans migrated from Richmond to Palo Alto, it's like Ann Arbor, you had the prestigious Stanford University there. The other Northern California suburban communities, they were unable to obtain housing because of de facto segregation practices. I read a couple months ago in Northern California, there has been a lawsuit against Wells Fargo for not lending to qualified African American potential homeowners. And then in Southern California, the Los Angeles area, I read that this bank, City National Bank, had to pay out millions to African-American homeowners. And we know that practice is called redlining, when they discriminate against homeowners based upon race. And that leads us to talking about Detroit. Ford's Willow Run plant right next to Ann Arbor and Ypsi, or Ypsilanti, had no provisions for African-American workers to reside in their factory. This was similar to Dearborn, which was Ford's main base. They created Inkster, Michigan. You passed it many times going to Detroit off of 94, just past the airport. It was created for African-Americans to live in. So African-Americans could buy large plots of land and build single-family homes. The Federal Works Administration proposed the Sojourner Truth Homes. This was the genesis of public housing in Northeast Detroit for African-American residents. Congressman Rudolph Tenowitz, one of the units assigned to white residents only for fear of declining property values. You see, we're seeing redlining trickle in that could be exacerbated with the development's presence. Despite the fears of integration, the Truth Homes allow for African Americans to move in. There was another public housing development on the west side of Detroit called Herman Gardens at the Southwood Freeway and Joy Road. And actually, the Northwest campus of Wayne County Community College, where I'm based at, used to be located right on the perimeter of this housing development. And they built these housing projects for whites, but they didn't move in. And by the 2000s, it was torn down, as well as other housing projects in Detroit for more modern homes. Throughout the United States, really, public housing was a failed experiment because within 10 years, these facilities became dilapidated. And then when crack cocaine came in, they became infested with drugs and crime, and they were not safe places to live. The Detroit Housing Commission eventually supported other government subsidized housing developments for African Americans and whites living in the perimeter. This picture you see here shows African Americans moving to Conant Gardens in Northeast Detroit. This was the first neighborhood built exclusively for the middle class base in Detroit. You had African American lawyers, doctors, professionals living in this area. School segregation. Most public schools in the United States, mainly in the South, were segregated by law after Reconstruction's demise. In states like California, where there's no legislation on segregation, Mexicans were classified as white, but illegal accommodations were made to put them in segregated schools. There was a US Supreme Court case, Mendez versus Westminster in the Los Angeles area. Before this happened, in 1882, the San Francisco School Board banned Chinese students from matriculating in public schools. And that's because 2 years prior to that, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act that prohibited Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. Although it was forbidden, Indiana had segregated schools for African-American children up until the 1960s. So it was legal until Brown versus Board of Education, but then it was a de facto practice. Miscegenation. Since their genesis, states in the South forbade interracial marriages. It was further enforced in the Black codes during Reconstruction. Mildred Loving identified herself as Native American and African American. Richard Perry, a white man, met Miss Loving in high school, and they resided in Caroline County, Virginia, which is in between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia. In 1958, they traveled north to Washington, D.C., where they could legally marry. Upon return to Virginia, after exchanging their nuptials, they were arrested in violation of the state's miscegenation laws since the marriage was deemed valid. They later moved to D.C. and challenged this injustice in federal court. In 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down miscegenation, stating that they were a direct violation of the 14th Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, the Equal Protection Due Process Clauses. Ironically, to add as an addendum to this, Thurgood Marshall, the hero who represented the NAACP in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, became the first African-American U.S. Supreme Court justice appointed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. So this is one of the first cases that he heard, a landmark case. Now we move on to affirmative action. So Reconstruction opened the doors for opportunities with African Americans' education and other sectors, but then the pendulum was swung backward. So now we had affirmative action come in. Executive Order 8802 prohibited discrimination in the defense industries, the first federal action to provide equal opportunity in the United States. And this also allowed for African Americans to work in the federal government. President Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens banned African Americans from working in the federal government. Even African American congressmen who were elected around the 1940s, they could not go in the Capitol Hill gym, they could not eat in the cafeteria, they had no separate facilities. Adam Clayton Powell, who was the first African-American congressman elected from the East Coast, he was from Harlem in New York, he was the one that got a bill passed over the heads of the Southern Democrats who were racist. So the Republicans in the South and the North passed a bill to desegregate all Capitol Hill facilities for African-American congressmen. Executive Order 9981 prohibited discrimination in the U.S. Armed Forces. They've been segregated since the Civil War. The Korean War in 1950 was the first integrated war. Executive Order 11246 prohibited discrimination in hiring practices with respect to government contracts. So now municipalities, when they had to improve their infrastructure with highway projects or building new schools and other major components to their daily lives, they had to have a certain number of African-American contractors bid or contractors of color, certain percentage. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission became a new federal government agency in 1965 to oversee that private and public sector employers in the United States complied with federal government mandates that protect employee rights on the basis of race, gender, age, religion, and sexual orientation. Now we transition to the post-affirmative action and civil rights movement. Major cities like Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and Cleveland had elected African-American mayors by the early 70s, which opened the doors for government contracts to be in the hands of non-whites. The gentleman you see on the left in the picture is Maynard Jackson, elected first African-American mayor of a southern city, Atlanta, in 1973 at age 35. So he joined Coleman Young in Detroit. Also, he joined Tom Bradley in Los Angeles as being the first African-American mayors elected of a major US city in the 1970s. The one thing that Maynard Jackson did with respect to affirmative action was he had a major project on his plate. The Atlanta airport was looking to modernize. And he said to the white power broker elite in Atlanta, if I don't get at least 7% participation from African Americans in the bids, there'll be no new airport built. So as you can imagine, the white power broker elite resisted for almost a year and a half. So after a deliberation with the city council, because the airport was under the auspices of the Atlanta city government, they finally gave in. So in 1980, the world's largest airport, or world's busiest airport, was opened up. And if you've been through Atlanta's airport today, it's now called the Maynard Jackson International Airport. Well, Hartsfield-Jackson is named for Mayor Hartsfield, but then they tagged Jackson's name on when he passed away some years ago. State universities, especially those that were segregated in the South, finally allowed for more African Americans to matriculate in them as students. More African Americans are gaining ground in the U.S. House of Representatives, and several African American U.S. senators have been elected, like Edward Brooke, who was the first African American U.S. senator elected since Reconstruction. And he was from Massachusetts. He was elected in the late 60s. And then you had Carol Moseley Braun on the right, to the right of Maynard Jackson. She was the first African American female U.S. senator elected in 1992 from Chicago. And she also became a U.S. ambassador under President Clinton. Since then, we've had several African-American U.S. senators elected. Barack Obama was elected in 2006, and he served until 2008 when he ran for president. Our Vice President, Kamala Harris, 2012, became the second African-American female U.S. senator elected. And today, we have 3 African-American U.S. senators. We have Cory Booker from New Jersey, Tim Scott from South Carolina, and Raphael Warnock from Georgia. African Americans also obtained high-level positions in corporate America as well as in the federal government, along with state and municipal entities. So, as I had said a few seconds ago, Barack Obama was elected in 2008, the first African American U.S. president, but then there were efforts being made to disenfranchise him by 2012. The Republicans in Pennsylvania and other states trying to enact stringent voter ID laws as a hindrance to prevent African Americans from voting. In Ohio, in counties like Hamilton, which is where Cincinnati is the county seat, they tried to liberally reduce the voting hours in the 2012 election for urban areas and caused discombobulation. So they wanted to close the polls intentionally in Cincinnati at 7 o'clock, but keep suburban polls open until 8. Florida had mass mailings sent out to neighborhoods of color, and they were to extrapolate who wasn't valid to vote based upon return to center responses. In 2013, you had Shelby versus Holder, U.S. Supreme Court case that took place dealing with Shelby County, Tennessee, where Memphis is the county seat. After the 2 elections of Barack Obama, voting rights are once again being challenged, states' rights versus federal government intervention. Major voters in the states under question still felt disenfranchised. The majority opinion on the Supreme Court was that Congress cannot subject to pre-clearance based simply upon past discrimination. The 2 women justices on the Supreme Court at the time, Sonia Sotomayor, the first Latina on the Supreme Court justice, and Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman selected to the Supreme Court, had dissenting opinions that Congress had sufficient evidence before it. As a result, many conservative states disenfranchised early voting and same-day registration. Black lives matter. Black lives have always mattered, but African Americans have basically been marginalized since our arrival in the slave ships that came to this country some 400 plus years ago. During the last term of Barack Obama, our first president, and leading up to his successor, there were many horrendous tragedies that affected African American men. On February 12, 2012, Trayvon Martin was visiting his family members in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. George Zimmerman, a neighborhood security guard, profiled him at a gas station because he had a hoodie on and a bag of Skittles and killed him. He was found guilty and never did any prison time. August 9, 2014, Michael Brown was outside a convenience store in suburban St. Louis in Ferguson, Missouri, was killed by a white police officer. He did not face conviction. But then the tide changed in the next year.
Cinnamon wasn't found guilty, was he? I think he was.
Okay, yes.
Killed Trayvon Martin.
Yes, I'm saying he was found not guilty. That's what I said.
Oh,
No, not guilty. Yeah, please hold the questions until the end. Thank you. I'm trying to get through. Yeah, I say he was found not guilty. I'm sorry. Oh, no, it's okay. The tide changed, as I said, on April 4th, 2015, with Walter Scott, who was murdered by a white police officer in North Charleston, South Carolina. Walter Scott was a motorist who was pulled over. He feared for his life, and he ran and was shot and killed in the back. That officer was sentenced to life in prison. On June 17, 2015, 9 parishioners were executed by white supremacists at Dylan Roof at Mother Emanuel Church, AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. He still remains on death row to this day. Before I go into George Floyd, there have been other instances of police brutality. The first one that was televised was Rodney King in Los Angeles, 1991. 4 Los Angeles police officers beat him, but he survived. The trial was moved to Simi Valley, a suburban area, and he was found guilty by an all-white jury. And there was an insurrection in Los Angeles for several days. There had not been an insurrection in the United States since 1980. There was an incident in Florida where a former Marine was killed in Miami, and similar to that, they moved the trial to Arthur McDuffie was his name, moved the trial to Tampa, and there was insurrection in Miami. Right after Rodney King in Detroit, there was Malice Green, 1992. This was not taped. He was killed by 2 officers, Walter Butts and Larry Nevers, who were part of Stress, a unit that antagonized African-American men. Shortly after the '67 insurrection in Detroit, they were found guilty. And now we arrive at May 25th, 2020. George Floyd was going to a convenience store in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he was alleged by the clerk that he had a counterfeit bill. When he got outside, he was met by Derek Chauvin and several of his colleagues on the Minneapolis police force. As you see in the picture, was that infamous scene where he put his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, cutting off circulation and killing him. This video was circulated all around the world on YouTube, TikTok. People went and marched in the streets, not just in Minneapolis, but in Tokyo, Rio de Janeiro, and London. As a result of this, this led to the conviction. Now, the irony is the lawyer in the Trayvon Martin case and the George Floyd case was Benjamin Crump. Many people thought that after the acquittal in the Trayvon Martin case of George Zimmerman, that he could not win a case again. He proved the world wrong 3 years ago. He had a very racially diverse legal team, and they were able to solidify victories. As a matter of fact, the state attorney general in Minneapolis is from Detroit, okay? Keith Ellison. So now we will revisit Juneteenth. So the civil rights movement and the Great Migration ushered in a decline of Juneteenth, but celebrations still continue to a degree in Texas. In 1978, 100,000 people began celebrating it in Milwaukee. In 1979, it was approved as a paid state holiday in Texas, commencing in 1980. By the end of the 80s, California, Washington, D.C., Georgia, Wisconsin, and Illinois commenced celebrations. By 2020, it became a paid state holiday. So pretty much the George Floyd situation will remove this, but you have to always acknowledge how this came about. Credit for Juneteenth being a national holiday really started with the movement led by Barbara Rose Collins, who was a former congresswoman from Detroit. It started in 1996, back when Clinton was president. So it took several presidents for this to happen. And finally, Joe Biden signed the Juneteenth National Day of Independence into law on June 17, 2021. So we see a lot of history in that picture. On the left, we have Kamala Harris, the first African-American U.S. Vice President and second African-American female U.S. Senator. In the middle, we have Jim Clyburn. Jim Clyburn is the first African-American congressman elected to Congress since Reconstruction. And then on the right is Raphael Warnock, the first African-American U.S. Senator elected from Georgia. Actually, he's going to be in Detroit next Sunday, speaking at the NAACP Fight for Freedom Fund dinner. To conclude, the fight for freedom is not over. African-American political leadership is on the decline in trailblazing cities like Detroit and Memphis. Gentrification is pushing out lifelong African-American residents from America's urban core who have been vested there for generations. Public schools are plagued with violence, inadequate infrastructure, declining enrollment, and a lack of African-American teachers. Unemployment is at a high among African Americans due to lack of education, availability of jobs, offshoring and outsourcing of jobs, and escalating tuition has deterred some African Americans from attending college. And also the federal government wants to cut back on providing assistance with grants and loans. So at this time, we've got about 25 minutes left. So I will take questions from the floor. So please raise your hand, give me your name, and we will entertain any questions. Any questions? Yes.
I'm Leslie, and I had a question. You said Barbara Rose Collins got the Juneteenth holiday in Milton.
Yes, she did.
So, how is she in relation to Opal Lee? Like, because I've always thought Opal Lee mothered the Juneteenth holiday.
Well, she did, but Barbara Rose Collins is the one that brought it to the attention of Capitol Hill. So I want to make sure everybody, gets credit. Okay, so Biden didn't do it all by himself. This was started, like I said, back during the Clinton administration, during Clinton's second term. So we must give everybody credit where credit is due. Anybody else? Any other questions? Take your time. Yes, sir. Your name?
The recent history is fascinating. My name is Dave.
Okay.
But something that still irks me is that when what caused Reconstruction to end so abruptly, as I remember, was a really funny political deal that got the Union troops withdrawn from the South.
Yes.
And as soon as those troops left, Jim Crow came back in earnest.
Oh, yes.
Can you say a little more about the politics of the end of Reconstruction and that dirty deal with the troops?
Well, yes. And see, that's because, when Reconstruction started, Andrew Johnson was president. He was a Democrat. He did not want the troops in the South. He felt that, it was violating states' rights. And then you had Ulysses S. Grant who came in and he had provisions, protections. But when Rutherford B. Hayes came in, then that's when it got watered down. He was weak. He was a weak president compared to his predecessor. And then, like I said in the slide previously, that the Southern Democrats took control of the House and the Senate. And that's when, the Southern politicians said, okay, send the troops home. We don't need this anymore. And we're still dealing with Reconstruction now. Look when Barack Obama came into office. We had Obamacare, all those things in. When 45 came in, he swung the pendulum back, just like after Reconstruction, just like I tell my students. I've been telling them for 19 years, history repeats itself. Nothing is new under the sun. Like I said, Black Lives Matter, that's nothing new. It was police brutality going on in the 60s. I mean, my dad and my cousins growing up in Detroit were antagonized by Detroit police, okay? And not just in Detroit, even more recently, I had cousins lived in Los Angeles. When they moved, one cousin's graduated U of M down the street. He moved to Los Angeles in the early 80s. And he told me, and this is before Trayvon Martin, he had a hoodie on, 22 years old, graduated with a degree in business from Michigan, going to a corner store, police profiled him and put him on the ground. 22 years old. He said, I just moved out here from Detroit, went to U of M, one of the best colleges in the United States. It didn't matter. It didn't matter to the police officers. Just like Malcolm X said, African-American man can have a tax shake case, Brooks Brothers suit on, he'll still be the N-word. He'll still be, a threat. We talked about, Black Wall Street, which happened over 100 years ago. African-American man was going to use an elevator in a building, and the white female elevator operator alleged that he groped her, touched her, and it set off insurrection, destroying Black-owned businesses. that have been built up for years over a lie. Same thing happened in Rosewood, a lie over a Black man raping a white woman. Okay, so I say this, to segue, is that, history, I mean, it repeats itself, and, that's why we have to vote. We have to have forums like this in order to stop history from repeating itself and the pendulum swinging backwards. Anybody else? Yes, Leslie, go ahead. It's okay.
About okay. So I've been in back and forth all week about, should we celebrate Juneteenth the way that it is currently celebrated in June? Because, it's my understanding that Juneteenth was actually in December, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And so I don't like to get caught up in that because it dilutes it, but I'd like to just hear your perspective on that. Like, how do we teach people that the laws, the amendments matter? It's not just some white man that came on a horse and said you're free.
Yes, well, like I said, we need to have discussions like this. I mean, look at this whole critical race theory movement. First of all, let me tell you something about critical race theory. It's a legal term. These conservatives are using this to confuse people, and they don't want to blatantly say, okay, we don't want to teach African-American history. We don't want to teach Latin American history or ethnic studies. So it's important that we have civics. They want to take civics out of the public schools. Why? If you have the right to vote, you need to know your rights. And that's why we got 45 in office, because a lot of these people who voted in that election never voted before. They don't understand, and the people who got in and on Capitol Hill, they don't understand the political process. So we need civics in the the high school, and we need civics in college. You shouldn't shut the door on learning how your country operates. Because we look at the instability in other foreign countries, and a lot of us got caught off guard by January 6th. We're like, oh, that would never happen in this country. Well, it did. It did. So it's a wake-up call, like I said, for us to have more forums like this, not just during Juneteenth, not just during Black History Month, but all throughout we have 365 days in the year. We need to have this all year. And you cannot stop the young people from learning. I mean, I just read Texas is now stopping DEI in colleges and universities. We look at the demographics now. Whites are the minority in this country, okay? And people of color are the majority. But the conservatives, they don't want to hear that. They want to swing, like I said, the pendulum backwards and not have diversity, equity, inclusion, which is, the big word now. So that's why we have to speak up and not be afraid. We have to vote. We have to vote in every single election. One time I got on one of my students, they said, well, I thought the only election to vote is the presidential election. No, you have to vote in your local elections, because my institution I teach at is just like, University of Michigan, we get state funds. You have to vote on, millages. I had a student who went to MSU, and he was transferring back to MSU, and I got him for not voting in the election. I said, don't you know you can vote for the board of trustees at MSU? These are people who can lower your tuition, okay, or create DEI. So we have to set a positive precedence with the youth. And by eliminating, diverse, equity, and inclusion, and having, intercultural dialogue, that's going to kill it. So we have to speak up. So I hope I answered your question, Leslie. Okay, anybody else? We still have time. We have about 20 minutes. Yes, what's your name, sir? Okay.
Did you touch bases on reparations at all, which is a big topic these days?
Oh, yes.
I just like to give some historical to that. I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina. Anyone knows the Civil War, that's where the first shots at Fort Sumter.
Okay, I hate to interject. My people were from Orangeburg,
okay,
right up the road. Yep.
And I'm fully aware of my family history. There was two families, one in Sumter and the other in.
Yes, my great-great-grandfather lived in Sumter, yes.
Boone plantation is still there. Part of my family is Boone and the other is Brown, because the Browns were in Sumter, South Carolina. So I can trail 300 years of slavery in my family. And what I'm hearing in terms of polls around the nation is that everyone, whether you're Latino, you're Asian, or particularly white, is against reparations.
Mhm.
And knowing my family history and slavery for 335 years to be exact, everything was gone and they worked for free. And I know that I deserve reparations based on my family history.
Yes.
But we have people who are really not citizens of this country for part, but they're commenting on reparation.
Mhm.
Japanese receive reparations in this
Yes.
country.
Yes.
The Indians receive some form of reparations for what happened to them in this country, but everyone seems to be against blacks receiving reparations. And I don't understand.
Well, it's because of, white supremacy and racism. They don't want us to have economic power and political power. And it's still being deliberated on Capitol. And I think as long as the Republicans control the House and Senate, we'll never see it happen. It doesn't matter if it's a Democratic president. That's my opinion of it. Would I like to see? Yes, I would. But in the meantime, there are other means, I believe, we can deal with economic empowerment of African Americans. And that is, I think we should unite with Latinos and Africans and other, immigrants and people of color, pull all of our monies together. That's one way I believe that we can develop economically instead of waiting on the government. Because I don't know if it's going to, quite frankly, I don't know if it's going to happen during the lifetime of most of us who are alive in this room. Okay. All fairness, I'll come back to you. What's your name, ma'am?
Or an exploratory committee, a commission to start to look at that. I think I just read something about that.
Wait, one at a time. We want to, make sure.
Just that my statement was that it appears that everyone is against it.
Right.
I
agree with
done. And when you ask Asians, especially when you ask whites and you ask Latinos, they said, why should they get reparations? These are people that have no sense in building this country. I can tell you 335 years of my family building this country and received nothing for it. I sincerely believe that we deserve reparations.
Agreed. And they have a committee over in Detroit too. Detroit City Council. Yep.
35 years, I can chronologize. I have the records of it. 335 years with nothing, absolutely nothing.
I meant to say that, and that maybe a little bit of progress is being made was my point.
A little bit isn't enough. We're sorry. Let's say a little bit. Look, you give a little and you take a lot.
Very well stated. Anyone else? Good points. You guys are bringing up some good points. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Kennedy. I actually go to a Texas public school. So it's
What city in Texas?
Austin.
Okay, the capital. I've been in Austin.
But and to your point, I completely agree that reparations are necessary, and it is completely based in white supremacy. That's the only reason, because this idea of encouraging the mono minority, that's giving money back as reparations to Chinese Americans who were discriminated against in the Industrial Revolution and onward. But the main thing that people in power fear isn't some kind of grassroots movement or voting harder. Like, you didn't vote hard enough last time, vote harder this time. It's class solidarity.
Oh, yes.
Because of institutionalized racism, class has become synonymous with race in this country, and that's completely by design.
It's not people at power, it's we the people.
Exactly.
It is that half of the country, particularly whites, are against it. They don't want to, they just don't believe that these people deserve anything despite. I can finalize again. Those years never left my mind. 335 years of absolutely nothing except degradation, disrespect.
Yes.
And it's completely by design. It's meant to seem distant to.
It's the next person. It's the other that said this needs to be done. It needs to be done now.
Yeah.
You're not saying that. What you're saying is that you're pointing the finger at someone else.
Well, I'm saying that class solidarity would be individual action historically hasn't caused a deep, meaningful, long-term material change. Like that, there are individual agitators that have led to movements, but it's it is we the people. It is, not unfortunately, but we do live in a democracy. And at the end of the day, we need to educate people, and nothing is going to happen if we continue to limit the amount of theory and the amount of history that are being taught to students, because you're right, to the majority of white people who are against reparations, that is just 350 years to them. They weren't born yet. They don't know about that. They will never be taught about it if the conservatives get their way and if they continue to make movements and make progress.
Yeah, I just want to mention, this is great. Like I said, my family, actually, we didn't receive monetary reparations, but we basically received apology. My great-great-grandfather was from South Carolina, born in Camden County on the Mulberry Plantation, one of the largest plantations in the South. And, well, I'm sorry, it was the largest in the state of South Carolina, one of the largest in the South. He was freed at age 8. He went all the way up to West Point, one of the first African-American cadets to attend West Point. And when he was getting ready to graduate, he was assaulted by white cadets in his room. He was tied like this. They tried to kill him. He had a court-martial, and they drummed up the notion that he was trying to commit suicide because he was African-American, and that no white cadet would dare, try to kill. So he was found guilty, but then President Chester A. Arthur overturned the verdict. He went back to South Carolina, got a law degree, and moved on. He became a high school principal in South Carolina and also in Oklahoma. Went out to Oklahoma, moved into an all-white neighborhood. His 2 sons came back from World War I, and they had to fight a battle at the family homestead because the Klan was trying to run out of the neighborhood. A white newspaper reporter came to the neighborhood, and my great-great-grandfather told the story at West Point. He cabled into the Oklahoma City newspaper. They stopped. And my great-great-grandfather's story was hidden from public knowledge for years until Dr. John Marzalek, who was a historian, was at the National Archives writing a book on Sherman and the Civil War. He stumbled upon the 12,000-page transcript of my great-great-grandfather's court-martial, looked up his descendants, and wrote a book. And then a movie, you should check it out. It's called Assault at West Point. It's on YouTube with Samuel Jackson and Samuel Waterston. He was on Law and Order. Movie was made, and then in 1995, people were moved by the movie that my family went to the White House, where President Clinton gave my great-great-grandfather a posthumous commission of second lieutenant, the rank he would have earned had he graduated from West Point. My students and others that I've told, I said, well, didn't your family want? No, we didn't want money. We just wanted people to acknowledge the sacrifice he made so that you would have the Tuskegee Airmen, so you would have General Colin Powell and other African-American men and women in the military. So yeah, money's important, but it really at the end of the day, it's not always about money. It's about intellect. I think we are so fixated on money, we forget about intellect. So that's why we're ushering in, this anti-intellectual climate to get rid of, diversity, equity, inclusion in public education, as well as with employers too. A lot of employers are now saying, well, we don't need to celebrate Black history. I know people that work at several federal government agencies, and you would think they would have an elaborate African-American history program, and some of them don't, okay? Because of the people that are running it are, those people who support, the far right and white supremacy. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments? We got about 10 minutes left. Yes, Leslie.
This is not about this particular, but you mentioned something about you touched on it about how Mexicans were labeled as white until the early 60s, I believe. Because I know there's this flotating idea of what race is. Could you speak to that?
Well, see, here's the thing. If that's what is so crazy about this country. Like, let's go back to when I talked about the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1880. Okay. And this was all because Asians were coming in and working in the mines in California on the railroads. They got into a skirmish with whites from the East. And so then they, used people of color as a scapegoats. They said, okay, let's shut the door on immigration. With Mexicans, okay, Mexicans have been catching hell since, heck, all the west coast of the United States was Mexico until the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo pushed Mexico further south, okay? And then they created new states of California, Texas, and all that. So really, white supremacists or the racists didn't see Mexicans on par with them. Same with, Asians, and even today with, the Middle Eastern population. So anybody that claims not true of Anglo-Saxon origin or has European origin, they cannot be on, equal playing field. So that's why I always talk about other races facing discrimination, segregation, just like African Americans. We were not the only ones, and that's why we need to teach this in the schools. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's not so much a fixation on the monetary aspect of things. It's just that a debt is owed.
Oh, I agree.
And the debt needs to be paid. And the only way you can pay it now, we know that there's a family in California where the beach land was stolen.
Yes, Manhattan Beach.
And just
south
recently,
of LAX airport. Yeah.
recently that was returned to them. But you have a lot of descendants of slaves that don't have those kind of documents. But in my case, I can prove 335 years of slavery within my family, the Brown.
Yes.
And, so it's not so much fixated on the monetary aspect. We feel a debt is owed and it should be paid.
Right.
And the best way to do it is monetarily.
Well, I agree. But like I said, I still stand by my suggestion of uniting different ethnic groups economically, because I'm becoming less optimistic given who's running this country now and who we are electing, that they are out for self-interest and self-gratification. These conservatives, they don't want to support affirmative action. They want to roll the door, backwards with that. I mean, we had a case right up here, University of Michigan, 20 years ago, Jennifer Grax. She claimed that people of color were getting to U of M who had lower ACT, SAT scores and GPAs, and then they put a referendum on the ballot to get rid of affirmative action in the state of Michigan. I had a cousin, the one who lived in California, graduated from U of M in 1982. He told me this is how it works for U of M. You got points for being black or white or whatever. You got points for being from the UP or points from being Detroit. So that's how the point system worked to try to have an equilibrium of the students that they admitted to U of M. And I don't know if they did this up at State or some of the other state universities, but I can only go based upon what my cousin said they did right over here at University of Michigan. And my whole thing is getting into undergrad school. It should be about, your GPA. It shouldn't be about the test scores, ACT. I wasn't a great test taker. Okay. So, we have all these barriers that have been created to suppress people of color from advancing in terms of education and even in terms of employment. You fill out the surveys and whatever. You go to some corporations, they have not hired an Asian, they have not hired an African American. Okay, and now with this pushback with affirmative action, they want to continue to maintain, an environment that doesn't have diversity. So we still, while we've made many gains in this country, we still have a long way. We haven't even elected a female president in this country. Canada's had a female prime minister, Britain, Argentina, India. We're dead. We were one of the last countries to allow women to vote. 19th Amendment was passed until 1920. But then African-American women in the South couldn't vote for another 44 years. Okay? So you have to look at the history. A lot of stuff that's happened recently, they're pushing back. Anybody else got about 5 minutes? Anybody else? Like I said, I'm really enjoying the response. Yes, sir.
You were dealing with some big stuff. I just wanted to bring up a complex thing. I'm Dave, okay?
Okay, I love complexity.
I grew up in Chicago.
Oh, yes.
Okay, and you left out our problems.
Actually, I did my senior thesis at Hampton University on the Great Migration of African Americans from Mississippi to Chicago.
And a highly segregated city.
Very, yes, still is.
A beautiful, vertically integrated Black economy.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And when segregation started to die and there was more integration, a lot of those Black businesses died.
Yes.
Okay. And now I fast forward to this morning's paper that says that 8 out of 10 Black-owned businesses fail in the first 2 years. And that, and I'm wondering, where can we go to give people who turned out for Juneteenth today to hope for employment and entrepreneurship that doesn't end up in failure down the road?
That's a very profound statement. And you're right, Juneteenth or just throughout the year, we have to promote. I have a lot of friends that are African-American entrepreneurs, and what they've done is see, when you look throughout history, the African-American church was the nucleus of the Black community. So that's how you knew about the Black-owned businesses. In Detroit, just like in the South Side of Chicago, you had Hastings Street. I-75 took away the Black-owned business in Detroit. They moved further out, and they're trying to recreate that in Detroit. But it's going to take a collaborative effort of everyone coming together to support that. And it's not easy. It really isn't, especially when you look at for businesses to get loans. There's still this redlining with loans for African-American businesses. You look at the Asians, you look at the Latinos, Arabs, they pull their money together. They don't go to the banks. They don't go to the banks. And I think our problem as African-Americans, we always think we have to go to the bank. No, we should look at how, other ethnicities or people of color have been successful. And that's what they did with Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Everybody put their money together. Everybody put their money together in Harlem and Sweet Auburn in Atlanta and Charleston and all these other cities that had strong African-American economic communities. So yes, I agree. Juneteenth is a springboard to motivate people, but it should be done. We have 365 days in the year. So, and one thing I think also is being taught too is financial literacy. We have to, teach that, because I think one reason a lot of businesses fail, and I know some people that have businesses that fails because they didn't manage the money right, they didn't have accounts. We need to know how to manage money. That's a major component of a business, managing money. If you can't manage money, you shouldn't be running a business. Yes, young lady.
On the thing about the fixation on financials, I think that's interesting because it by design, proven by statistics,
Yes.
African Americans are one of the most likely populations
in the United States of America to experience food insecurity. So
Yes,
I think
food
it is the goal of people who oppose reparations on a racist basis to say things like, why do you guys always just want to talk about money? Let's talk about what's in our hearts right now. Like, if you say that to someone who's like, okay, I love talking about what's in my heart, but what is my kid going to eat for dinner tonight? Because we don't have any food at home. Right. So I think it is a little bit, I think one should reflect if they find themselves siding with the people who are working in bad faith to actively continue disenfranchising people. And I think that reparations would be a show of good faith, because if you give out reparations, but you do it in that disingenuous way that a lot of conservatives like to talk about, where they're like, we'll give you a coupon. It's like, that just continues the infantilization of
just saying just handouts, that's what they labeled affirmative. But now if you look at the statistics let me tell you two things. Affirmative action. Most of the benefactors, if you look statistically, affirmative action have been white women. Most of the people who are on public assistance in this country are white Americans, not African Americans. When Reagan came in the 80s, he had a smear campaign saying that African American mothers, they showed one in Chicago, were welfare queens. They said African Americans, they had the Bakke decision with the Supreme Court. That was what that picture was in the affirmative action slide, was reverse discrimination. Al Bakke was a white man who was trying to get into the University of California Davis Medical School, claiming that lesser qualified African Americans or people of color MCAT scores were able to get in. He wasn't, and he won that case because at that time, the Supreme Court was somewhat conservative. So it's just like I said, the media is guilty. Fox News and all these networks that are promoting this foolishness are brainwashing people. And sometimes I tell my students and others, sometimes we have to turn the TV off and get books and read. That's the thing with the social media stuff. I mean, I'm a Generation Xer, and I mean, my parents are mostly books on Harriet Tubman and all that. I've got a lot of family history on both sides of my family, and that's why I love history with a passion. But now, a lot of people don't want to read. They want to see stuff on TikTok and all that. They want to live in a false reality or parallel universe. And that's why we need more educational programs to make sure that our young people see reality and are not living in a fantasy world. Yes.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
One more question. Let's let somebody else. Someone else, I appreciate you, Leslie and Sir. Is there anyone else that hasn't said anything, wants to say something? We'll give you the opportunity here. Anybody? Okay, we'll go back to. Oh, Leslie, I'm sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
I just was gonna say, speaking about the food insecurity, I also think that part of it is there is a level of shame or humiliation to have to
Yes.
go to like a food pantry every week versus having the ability to just feed your family, period.
Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? And so when you say, you know, you should vote or you should do these things, those are all things that empowered people
Right.
do. Those are things that people who feel valued do.
Mhm.
You know, you can't go to the same people that you squashed down for 364 days and
Yes.
then come to those same people and say, you need to vote
Mhm.
or else.
All right, I just want to elaborate and I'll close out on the food desert thing. Yes, it's a big issue in Chicago. It's been a big issue in Detroit. I remember growing up in Detroit and Farmer Jack was the major groceries chain in southeastern Michigan. And they opened up a lot of new stores in Detroit in the strong African-American communities and even the communities where there were lower incomes. When Farmer Jack merged with Kroger, Kroger decided not to invest in the city. So then Detroit became a food desert pretty much, I would say, from about 1995 until almost several years ago. So now with the gentrification in the city, now Meijer is in the city. We have two Meijers in Detroit, and now there's a Whole Foods in Midtown Detroit. Papa Joe's, they're getting ready to build more stores, but you need stores that everyone can afford. Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, you need to have stores for everyone. You have to build an equilibrium. And further out in the city, there are a lot of urban farms. So now people can come to these urban farms, get fresh vegetables. And there are co-ops, Leslie and others that are opening up in Detroit, African-American owned co-ops that are in the neighborhoods where people don't have transportation to get to 8 Mile where the Meijer is in all those stores. So we're out of time, but I want to close by saying thank you all for coming out. Here's my contact information. I'll keep it up here. If you would like for me to come to speak to your church, community group, or place of employment, I'll be more than happy to come out. That's my personal email, my business number, cell number, or if you just want to contact me about just resources on African-American history for yourself, for your grandchildren or family members, you know, please don't hesitate to contact me. So once again, it's been an honor to come out here to Ann Arbor. And if you want to talk to me afterwards, I've got a few minutes, we can talk. Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you, sir.